I want to acknowledge that I'm on Pakenji land, and I want to pay my respects to the elders past and present, and to acknowledge the continuities of culture that exist in this place. And I especially want to acknowledge and recognise the extraordinary efforts that they've made to protect the river, to be as custodians of the river of which they are a part, and which is part of this networks that interconnect us all across the whole continent. The judgment that I wrote about is the case of Bugmy, and I'm coming from the town. I'm actually in the town that he grew up in at the moment, Vulcania. In the judgment that I do, I tackle a few different topics that have increasingly become obvious to me, and took me a lot of hard work to actually see myself because of my own participation in the criminal so-called justice system, better named a criminalisation system because it's very good at that. And that is, first of all, the deficit discourse in which we engage. And as a defence lawyer, we engage in the pathologising of Aboriginal peoples, which locates and individualises the cause and the explanation for a criminal offence, if not within them, within their immediate communities, but still refuses to take into account that larger context of colonisation and colonialism, which is a convenient sort of elision that can't be justified from my point of view, particularly as it's clearly the one thing that all Aboriginal peoples across the continent have in common. And the other is to do with race and racialisation, the way that we participate in that. That is that we transform people into a race. This is one of the great myths of colonisation, that if somebody's a race, then it means that it's a category that's susceptible to descriptions. Historically, of course, have been described as being tribal, brutish, stupid, the missing link, all sorts of gross things like that. That's the category. Now there's all sorts of other ascriptions to do with race that are sort of somehow conflated with culture, which is a pretty crude understanding of the nature and the sophistication of that term culture, about what it actually means and how dynamic it is and how fluid it is. But it still manages to ignore that one fundamental thing, and it's not just about connection to country, that we are of country. That's what race actually manages to achieve. And if we believe that we're a race, then colonisation is won. But similarly, colonisers believe that they have won and insist upon it because they have removed us from country, when the reality is you can't remove country from country. That's why, Aileen Moreton Robinson talked about that when she's written about the white possessive and this discomfort, this continuing discomfort that colonisers have, that no matter, even if they remove people from country, even if they're in a prison cell, they're still actually of country. Another really important aspect is about responsibility and positionality, and the fact that lawyers refuse to do this. And now the culture within law resists truth-telling and continues to reinscribe colonising state law and infrastructures. That is, it continues to support that culture of not confronting the participation of law in the violence and the removals of First Peoples from their places, from their families, from their responsibilities for the destruction of knowledge, passing on of knowledge about place, etc. There's a refusal to admit that, and one of the things that I really push for in the judgment as a strategy to address this is that judges themselves begin to acknowledge their own positionality, rather than putting themselves in this sort of omniscient, godlike, oracular position, which is the great tradition of the Judeo-Christian courts that have been transplanted over here, this pretense that they can actually declare with authority and neutrality the truth to deliver justice. But instead, what I want them to do is actually to acknowledge who they are and the limitations of what they can see. Now, this is actually something that it's absolutely impossible to achieve that currently within our criminal justice system, and means that any judgments we put up like that will be overturned in the higher courts. So, So I guess the thing is, for me, like I was really surprised, despite my experience as an appellate lawyer, some time ago now, but and how astoundingly uncomfortable I found this process, because there are so many things that I discovered within me that had been cultivated in me through law school and then through legal practice. You know, so much ideology, but also there's something that's actually incorporated into my being now as a state lawyer, that it was really existentially quite challenging to write the judgment, and I was also frankly fearful of what my friends, my colleagues, former colleagues in the profession, many of whom are now quite senior barristers and are on the bench, because it's very critical, frankly. But I come from a position of somebody who's in their same position as them. I've participated in that, but I guess I do have a relatively unique position. There's so few of us who are actually criminal lawyers who practice, who are First Peoples. But having that simultaneously, that insider and outsider perspective on the practice. So I did actually lay myself bare somewhat, in that I did describe myself and my childhood, and the way that I disclosed my standpoint was by mapping out the different advantages that I'd had. And part of that, which I didn't mention, is a marker of skin colour and appearance, which is this freakish passport. It's a very uncomfortable, prickly passport to be carrying around in your back pocket. But but it's certainly something that I didn't have to endure, and I also didn't have to grow up in a place like Wilcannia. I had an opportunity to practice for a short period of time in northwest New South Wales, especially in a town called Walgett. And the constraints that operate on everybody in that place, that are driven by race, notions of race, the way those imaginings are captured by that race is somehow identifiable through appearance, etc. It really constrains the possibility of beautiful, constructive relationships that could be there, particularly when you're in the places of these astounding rivers that flow through the west of New South Wales. So the judgment itself, it's written as an imagined additional dissent judgment. The first iteration I really tried to take law seriously, but it just got to the point where I just couldn't do it, because part of that was because of rules that are in place which actually aren't just, and they're not logical, and they're not reasoned, but they're actually just rules that would mean that the appeal could never get up on the grounds that I propose. But the other, which is interesting, that constrains it, is just the culture. It would be rejected because of the culture in ways that people are so unconscious that work within the legal system, and that's what's really hard to deal with. That's the thing that for me I found really personally confronting to cope with. So so it's written as this judgment, and it basically just tackles the core evil of the Bugmy decision. And it was, from my point of view, it's a completely missed opportunity to reorientate the courts with respect to criminal law, and to acknowledge the incredibly powerful part that criminal law has increasingly played in the ongoing colonisation of people, and the way that that is so fundamentally at the core of structural discrimination within our legal system now. Thanks for your time. Knowledge accrue.